This is the first time ever that I am aware that we've had a murder occur within the Pinellas County Jail. Certainly a very unusual occurrence, one that is concerning, and I'm going to explain to you what happened that led up to this event in the early morning hours today. The victim in this homicide is Kelly Harding. He's a white male, date of birth 4/29/65. He was 6'1" and 140 pounds. The suspect and the person that has been charged with his murder is Scott Greenberg, and he's a white male with a date of birth of 10/1984. He's 6'3" and 170 pounds. Harding has been in the Pinellas County Jail since October 27th, 2012. Originally, Harding was charged with burglary, and he had a bond that he couldn't make, so he remained here in the jail. In January of 2013, Harding pled guilty to a lesser included offense of the burglary and a trespass charge, and he was sentenced to 1 year in the Pinellas County Jail. Since November of 2012, Harding has been classified in a protective custody status. And the reason why Harding was classified in that status is because he had been making racial slurs toward other inmates. He was spitting on inmates, and his behavior within the jail was very disruptive. He had thrown water on staff, he had defecated in a recreation yard, and a variety of other behavioral issues. Yesterday, at about 9:45 in the morning, Harding was moved from the cell that he was in within the jail, in a unit that we call F5, and he was moved to a unit that we call D6 or Delta 6, and it's another protective custody housing unit within the jail. And he was moved, as regularly happens throughout inmate stay, because of the need for various cells to be used for other inmates. Delta 6 is in the South Division of the Pinellas County Jail, and it is a cell in which that pod, where there were 23 inmates at that time. Because it's a protective custody housing unit, the inmates are on 30-minute checks within that pod, which means every 30 minutes a detention deputy goes by and makes sure that everybody is doing what they should be doing and is safe within that housing unit. From 9:45 yesterday morning until approximately 9:55 p.m. last night, Harding was in a cell by himself within Delta 6. At about 9:55 last night, jail personnel moved Greenberg from the jail medical wing, which is the building that you're in here now. And he had been here in the jail medical wing because he had fallen while he was in the shower yesterday, and he was over in South Division. They brought him over here for observation because he had fallen and hit his head, and they wanted to make sure he was okay. But last night the medical staff cleared him for medical observation, and he was transferred back over to South Division. And they assigned him to Delta 6. Because Greenberg was also on protective custody status, he was assigned to that same housing unit that Mr. Harding was in. Now, Greenberg had been in protective custody status because he had been aggressive toward staff. He actually swung at a staff member previously, and he had been aggressive toward other inmates and had a history of fighting with other inmates here in the jail. As I mentioned, Mr. Harding in Delta 6 was in a housing unit that was protective custody, and he was by himself in a cell. But when these inmates are assigned inside to these various pods, so when they get assigned to the pod, inside the pod, which are multiple cells, they choose their own cells. So when Greenberg got in there last night, he happened to choose the cell that Harding was already in, so that they became cellmates. We have no knowledge that Harding or Greenberg knew each other prior to last night at about 10 o'clock. This pod was put in lockdown at 11 p.m. last night, which is normal. The jail is shut down at 11 o'clock. The inmates are locked into their cells for the night. Deputies performed all of the required 30-minute checks. There was no lapse in the 30-minute checks. Everything that was supposed to be done was done. Between 11 o'clock p.m. when the housing unit was locked down and 12:52 a.m. this morning, which is the last time the check was done, and deputies did not observe anything unusual. At 12:58 a.m., deputies responded back to the pod, so 6 minutes after the last check that was done, because Greenberg was yelling that there was a man down within his cell, and the man down was Mr. Harding. When deputies responded, they found Harding lying on the floor. He was unconscious and he was in cardiac arrest. He was fully clothed and there was no sign of any sexual abuse. Jail personnel and emergency medical services personnel provided Harding with medical treatment. He was transported to the hospital where he was pronounced dead at 2:35 a.m. this morning. While at the hospital and in the emergency room physician, in examining Mr. Harding, found that he had toilet paper and wet toilet paper that was crammed down his throat. And they removed what it now constitutes 2 3-ounce containers of toilet paper that had been jammed down Harding's throat. Through their investigation, robbery homicide detectives learned that just before Greenberg began yelling, so just before Mr. Greenberg began yelling that a man was down, he yelled to another inmate in the pod, "I did it, it's done." And when the other inmate asked him what he had done, he replied, "What I am in here for." Back on August 28th of 2012, the St. Petersburg Police Department arrested Greenberg on a charge of second-degree murder. And some of you may recall this homicide in St. Petersburg. The victim in the homicide was Jennifer Zale, who was Greenberg's girlfriend. And he was charged with second-degree murder because he strangled her, choked her, and stuffed toilet paper down her throat to kill her. Deputies also learned that earlier last night, Greenberg told other inmates that he was in jail on the second-degree murder charge and that he was not going to do life in prison and that he wanted to go to death row. In subsequent interviews with other inmates in that pod, prior to Greenberg yelling out, several of the inmates reported that they heard thumping and gurgling sounds coming from the cell that Greenberg and Harding were occupying. Further, as Greenberg left the cell after deputies entered, he told the deputies that they, quote, needed to make this a crime scene and indicated to deputies that Harding was dead. An autopsy was performed today by the Pinellas County Medical Examiner's Office, and Harding's injuries are consistent with strangulation, and the injuries that Harding suffered are very, very close, if not identical, to the same injuries that Jennifer Zale suffered when she was choked, strangled, and had toilet paper stuffed down her throat by Greenberg. In fact, some of the same bones in her neck are the same bones that were broken in the neck of Mr. Harding. Harding has an extensive criminal history for loitering and prowling, burglary, cocaine possession, dealing in stolen property, and a firearms charge. Greenberg also has an extensive criminal history of kidnapping, possession of cocaine, burglary, grand theft auto, armed burglary, and fraud. At this time, Greenberg is in a single isolation cell here within the Pinellas County Jail, and again has been charged with first-degree murder. So that's the sequence of events as to what transpired, and I'm willing to take any questions you have.
Sure. When inmates are in protective custody, is it normal for them to share cells? Is that something that normally happens?
Some do and some don't. Some are in single cells by themselves, and some, when they're in a protective custody status, are in cells with other inmates. We do have a shortage of single cells, so it is preferable with many of these inmates that they be in a single cell by themselves, but we only have so many. And in fact, that's the reason why Mr. Harding was moved, because he had been in a single cell by himself. But based upon need, a determination was made that there was another inmate who was a higher risk that needed a single cell more than Mr. Harding did. So that's why he was moved yesterday, to make room for somebody else. He was still in a protective custody status. It was still a protective custody housing unit, but that's why he was moved.
As far as the toilet paper, is that readily available in those cells? So it's something that would be approved and it's in the cell with them?
Yes, inside these cells, so if you picture the housing unit, just picture one big open room. And then within the room, there are individual cells. So there's a day room area, but in each individual cell, there's a bunk, and there's a toilet, and there's a sink. And what would go with the toilet would be the toilet paper. It's very stark in those cells. There's not much in there as a general rule, but toilet paper is something that is in the cells, yes.
Do we think that he strangled him or choked him in addition to stuffing the toilet paper down his throat? Is that?
Yes, the evidence is consistent with that, and the bone right in the front of his neck, in Mr. Harding's neck, was fractured, and based upon the evidence and the results of the autopsy, the information we have is that it looks like that he was choked, strangled, and the toilet paper stuffed down his throat, both.
Is there a strategy in terms of how inmates are grouped, like in terms of grouping violent inmates with a violent history with inmates with a nonviolent history? Yes,
we have a classification system here at the jail. We use an objective classification system, and as a general rule, violent inmates are not grouped with nonviolent inmates. However, in this situation, they were both in protective custody status, and sometimes it happens where protective custody status inmates are grouped together just because of a lack of other places within the jail to house them. Again, single cell space is limited, so sometimes that does happen.
Was there a surveillance camera?
No, in that particular housing unit, there is no surveillance camera that would have captured this.
How many other surveillance cameras? Common, other?
Not in that division of the jail. In South Division, we don't have a comprehensive video surveillance camera system. Here in healthcare, in Central Division, other places of the jail, cameras are more prevalent. That division, South Division, is the oldest facility that we have. It was built back in 1980, 1981. It doesn't have a camera system in it.
Is there any kind of investigation into the deputies or the guards that were in charge?
Well, we're going to conduct a very thorough inquiry of everything, and as part of the process that's ongoing right now. Preliminarily, as far as the deputies are concerned, they did the 30-minute checks, and everything that we know right now is that they didn't do anything that was improper. But this is something, certainly, when you have a homicide within the Pinellas County Jail, and this is the first time ever that has happened, it is, of course, something that we're going to look at very closely and very thoroughly, and we're going to do a comprehensive review of everything that occurred. So there'll be a thorough investigation.
Sure. Based on this incident and the Thomas Morrow incident, do you guys feel like you have a problem keeping inmates safe? It sounds like you do a lot to keep them safe, but we've had two just in the last month here. Yeah. One beat, another one now dead.
Well, in that incident you refer to is the inmate that was in the back of the transport van. You know, remember, I think it's important to remember that we book here at the Pinellas County Jail on average about 48,000 people a year. Our average daily population is about 3,000 inmates. Things happen from time to time, and just because you have one incident doesn't mean that you have a big problem. These things do happen, and this is the first time ever that we've had a murder within the jail. I think the Thomas Morrow situation is different, totally different than this situation. You know, Morrow was in the back of the van. He was being transported to the jail. Fell off the bench, and for whatever reason, the other prisoner decided to stomp him. It's terrible, it's horrific, but does that mean that we have a problem? I think we have a problem with society where people want to brutalize each other, and certainly we take all the steps that we can and should to make sure that people stay safe. We want them to be safe. When they do something wrong and they end up in custody, we have an obligation to make sure that they themselves stay safe. And we take that obligation very seriously. We're going to do everything we can to make sure that happens. It doesn't mean that we're not going to look and review processes and make sure that there isn't anything that we could have done differently. And in both of those cases, that review is ongoing. But as far as, is there a problem in keeping inmates safe? No. And I think the evidence speaks for itself with that, in that, again, we have 3,000 inmates every day in this facility. Every day we have 3,000 people. And this is the first time anything like that's ever happened. This is the very first time in that transport situation with Murrow. It's the very first time that that's ever happened. So I think it's an unfortunate coincidence that in a short period of time we've had these two incidents.
Sheriff, do you have any plans to possibly increase the inmate checks that you have, instead of doing every half an hour, maybe do it more frequently?
No, there's no reason, no indication. There are some within the jail, depends upon the classification in the housing unit and what. Some are on 15-minute checks, and we have some people within the jail that are on constant observation. There's a deputy watching them with eyes on them constantly. So it ranges throughout the facility. And so we do have that in place, where some people are on constant observation. Again, there's never a time when eyes are off them, some 15-minute checks, some 30-minute checks. But it comes down to a matter of what's realistic, what's necessary. You try and get it right. But there's no indication here that if they had been on any greater frequency of checks, that the outcome would be any different. If Greenberg had a plan to do this, and this is what he wanted to do, then of course all he would do is time it at intervals. Now I think that it's probably not a coincidence that the deputies do stagger their checks. So when we say that they're on 30-minute checks, that doesn't mean 30 minutes every 30 minutes. Is that they do stagger it so that the inmates, so it's not predictable, so the inmates can't do the mischievous things they do because they know the deputies do to come back. But think about the timing of this. This happened 6 minutes after the check was done. So that tells me that he purposefully did it right after the deputy left, because chances are the deputy's not coming back 6 minutes after he left.
So do you know how long it took for him to end his life?
We don't know that. I mean, as long as it takes to choke somebody out and stuff toilet paper down their throat. I mean, that could take a matter of a minute, a couple minutes.
So was the toilet paper stuffed down his throat after he passed, or do you have an indication that he was still alive when that happened?
Yeah, we don't know. That will have to wait for a final determination by the medical examiner on. Again, the autopsy was just today. We don't have their report, and that's something the medical examiner will have to make a determination on. Like I said, at the hospital there was toilet paper taken out of his throat, and there was still a foreign object, which is believed to be toilet paper, in his throat during the autopsy. So that's something we're going to have to wait for the medical examiner to make a determination.
Sure. Obviously overcrowding is a problem at most jails. Do you guys need more space for those in protective custody so that they aren't grouped together? I mean, is this a problem?
Yeah, this isn't a straight overcrowding problem. This is, to that extent, is that we do and have always needed more single cell space. And we've said that for a while, and we work the best we can with what we have. And as we plan for the future, that is something that we know that we do need. But, and again, the population varies, and it waxes and wanes, and sometimes it's okay and sometimes it's not. So, but that's always been a challenge. I think it's a challenge for every jail, is to have enough single cell space, because they are so personnel intensive and space intensive. So, it's not what I would characterize as a major problem. It's a matter of juggling a lot and moving the pieces around on the board. So, in here in this situation, you just can't have in every single jail, you can't have every inmate in a private room. Okay? You can't have every inmate in a single cell. And you're going to have some that are clearly fine in what we call direct supervision housing units. And right here in Central Division, and we have one deputy in there with 80 inmates. They're all housed in dormitory style. We don't have any incidents or any problems with it. Some need to be on absolute close observation, where they are in there and by themselves, and there's a deputy watching them all the time. So I'd say that a lot of this is an art. It's not a science. You try and take the best information you have. We try and use that objective classification system by looking at the inmates, looking at their history, looking at their conduct within the jail, any indicators we have of problems, and we try and make the best decision, the right decision. And I think that that's what they were trying to do yesterday, is that they saw an inmate who, had a history with us of some problems. I wouldn't call the problems that he had severe or serious. He had some issues. So it's ideal that he be in a protective custody status, but the person that they replaced him with in that single cell was worse. So it's a matter of choices.
Would you be able to speak a little bit to the incidents that the suspect had been involved with before in the jail? He said he had some aggressive incidents.
Yeah, and those were involved, kicking another inmate, some fighting with other inmates, that kind of activity, where he kind of got into it with the other inmates.
He's under constant supervision now, or he's by himself?
Now, obviously now he's in the cell by himself, and will remain, in that status. So he's in a single cell by himself now.
Has he said anything about why or what made, parties so special or anything like that?
No, other than the statements that I gave you, and I read you the quotes that he did make in what we have, other than that, no. When the detectives tried to interview him, he refused to be interviewed.
Could you just talk about how violent of an act this was, this attack? I mean,
Well, obviously, when somebody is choked out and then has toilet paper stuffed down their throat, I mean, it's pretty violent. But again, this is very consistent with what Greenberg did. And if you want the details of that, in the arrest affidavit, which is in the Viper system, it lays out the details of what happened in the homicide in St. Pete, for which he was arrested in here on the second-degree murder charge. It lays it out. It almost looks very similar, almost identical to what happened here.
So he appeared to choke him with his hands, and there wasn't any other weapons,
No. The only difference is, and that's why I made reference to it, in the St. Pete incident, and the reason why I was charged with second-degree murder in the St. Petersburg incident is he was having sex with his girlfriend, and the choking, the cramming of the toilet paper down her throat was while they were having sex. And so, but here, there's no indication of that whatsoever. There's no indication of any sexual act. Mr. Harding was fully clothed, he had socks on, there's absolutely no indication of that. So that's why I made reference to that in my remarks.
Do you feel, based on these comments you made to other inmates, that he didn't want to spend life in jail, and that, he was going to death row, that maybe this was a plan that he had in the shower even before to get to?
We'd have to get into his head to figure that out. Well, what's clear, I believe, from the statements that he made, is that he had a plan and he executed the plan. And when so he said to somebody before, is that I'm in here on second-degree murder charges. I don't want to do life. I want to go to death row. I'm going to be on death row. And then he does what he does, and then he yells out before he starts yelling "man down." So this is before he starts calling for help. Is that he tells the other inmate in there that this is what he had done. And when they ask why, well, the same thing I'm in here for. And so what's the same thing he's in here for? The same thing he's in here for is choking somebody out, stuffing toilet paper down their throat, and killing them. So he had a plan. He just decided to execute that plan, unfortunately, early this morning. All right, thanks.